The dust of the training grounds settled on everything. A fine brown powder that coated boots, clung to uniforms, and lived in the air like a constant gritty ghost. It was a place of noise, of shouted commands and the rhythmic thud of boots on packed earth. Yet for Sergeant Eva Rostova, it was often a place of profound silence. The silence was not of her own making. It was a wall, built brick by brick with the glances of dismissal, the whispers that died when she drew near, and the most glaring omission of all, the withheld salutes. She walked with a purpose that seemed to spring from her very bones, her posture straight, her gaze fixed forward. She wore her fatigues without adornment, the fabric clean but faded from countless washes, stark contrast to the crisp, new uniforms of the younger soldiers who saw her as little more than a fixture, a name on a roster who filled a slot. They saw her slight frame, her face that held a youthfulness that belied the age in her eyes, and they made their judgment. And their judgment was wrong. The ringleader of this quiet mutiny was Corporal Thorne, was everything Eva was. Not loud, ostentatiously confident, his uniform a canvas for every minor qualification badge he could possibly display. He moved with the swagger of a man who believed his own hype, followed by a small cohort of acolytes who mirrored his arrogance. As Eva crossed the parade ground, her path intersected with Thorne and his crew. They were laughing, their voices carrying easily on the dry afternoon air. Thorne saw her coming. A smirk played on his lips. He stood a little straighter, a deliberate caricature of military bearing, and as she passed, he turned his head pointedly. Staring at a distant barracks, his right hand remaining stubbornly at his side. The gesture was a small thing, a brief, silent insurrection. But in the rigid world of military protocol, it was a cannon shot of disrespect. His friend snickered, a low, guttural sound of shared contempt. Eva stopped. She didn't flinch or raise her voice. She simply turned, the dust swirling around her boots, and fixed her gaze on Corporal Thorne. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. Her eyes, a clear, steady gray, held no anger, no outrage. Instead, they held a deep, resonant disappointment, a sorrow that was far more unsettling than any shouted reprimand could ever be. Thorne's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second under the weight of that gaze. He had expected a confrontation, a sputtering of regulations that he could brush off. He had not expected this heavy, powerful silence. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Eva gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a sad, unchangeable fact. Then she turned and continued on her way, her footsteps the only sound in the sudden, awkward stillness. Her dignity was her shield, her silence her response. If you believe true character is forged in fire, not announced with a trumpet, then subscribe to see how this story of quiet strength unfolds. The incident was not isolated, it became a quiet, corrosive pattern. In the mess hall, Thorne's group would speak of desk jockeys and quota promotions just as she passed their table with her tray. When she was on the training range, demonstrating a flawless weapon strip to a group of new recruits, Thorne would stand at the edge of the crowd, observing with a critical, condescending air, as if he were the authority and she the student. Each slight was a stone thrown into a still pond, and Eva simply let the ripples fade without reaction. She endured it all with a stoicism that the arrogant mistook for weakness. They couldn't see the resilience humming beneath her skin, a strength forged in places they had only read about in field manuals. Master Sergeant Elias Vance saw it, though. Vance was a man who seemed to be carved from the same unyielding rock as the nearby mountains. He had served for 30 years, and his eyes had a way of seeing past the polished brass and starched uniforms to the true measure of a soldier beneath. He had observed the silent war Thorne was waging against Rtova, and it troubled him. One evening, he found her in the base's small, under-resourced library, poring over topographical maps of a region that hadn't been in the news for years. "Don't let them get to you, Sergeant," Vance said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't need to specify who they were. Eva didn't look up from the map immediately. She traced a ridge line with her finger, her touch delicate, as if remembering the feel of that very earth. Finally, she raised her head. "The loudest barrels are always the emptiest, Master Sergeant." She echoed his own sentiment back to him, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "I know, thank you." Her words were few, but they carried a weight of understanding that satisfied Vance. He nodded, leaving her to her maps and her memories, more certain than ever that Sergeant Rtova was an iceberg, with 9/10 of her story hidden deep beneath the surface. Weeks passed, and the desert sun continued its relentless bleaching of the landscape. Thorne's disrespect, fueled by Eva's seeming passivity, grew bolder. He saw her silence not as dignity, but as an admission of inferiority. His campaign of insolence became a public spectacle, a lesson for his followers on how the real hierarchy worked. A hierarchy based on swagger and perceived grit, not the rank sewn onto a collar. The silent witnesses, the broader population of the base, watched with varying degrees of discomfort. They were bystanders in a play they didn't fully understand, hesitant to step onto the stage and challenge a character as forceful as Thorne. Then the announcement came. It crackled over the base-wide comms system during morning formation, a voice from headquarters bringing news that sent a current of excitement through the ranks. A major week-long training exercise was scheduled. It was not to be an ordinary drill. It would be led by a guest instructor, a decorated operator from a Tier 1 Special Operations unit. A name so classified they were referred to only by their title, the Pathfinder. The buzz was immediate. Soldiers gathered in small, excited groups, speculating on who it could be. Thorne was at the center of one such group, his voice the loudest. "This is it, boys," he proclaimed, puffing out his chest. "A chance to learn from a real legend. It's time to separate the men from the, well, you know," he glanced pointedly in the direction of the supply depot, where Eva was quietly overseeing the loading of equipment. A small, dismissive smile on his face. He was determined to impress this mythic warrior, to prove his own mettle. While the base hummed with anticipation, Eva's routine remained unchanged. She was the first one on the running track at dawn, her stride steady, and even as the sky bled from purple to orange, was the last one in the gymnasium at night. Her movements precise and economical as she worked through a grueling regimen that would leave most other soldiers gasping. She was a study in discipline, a silent testament to the power of unceasing preparation. She never spoke of her past, of the freezing nights, the searing days, the moments when life and death were separated by a single, perfectly controlled breath. She didn't have to. She carried it all within her, in the coiled readiness of her muscles, and the far-seeing gaze that missed nothing. The evening before the exercise was set to begin, Master Sergeant Vance found her standing before the base's memorial wall. It was a simple granite slab, etched with the names of those from the division who had fallen in distant, dusty lands. Her hand was hovering just inches from the stone, not quite touching a name. "Tomorrow's the big day," Vance said softly, standing beside her. "Heard they're flying this Pathfinder in tonight." The commander's practically giddy. Eva's eyes remained on the wall. "Every day is a big day, Master Sergeant," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. There was a profound sadness in her tone, a connection to the etched names that was deeply personal. Vance looked from her face to the wall and back again. A sudden, startling thought began to form in his mind, a puzzle piece clicking into place. "They don't know who you are, do they, Eva?" he asked. The use of her first name, a mark of his dawning respect. Eva finally turned to him. The weary smile she offered was filled with 1,000 untold stories. She said nothing more, just gave him a slight nod and walked off into the gathering twilight, leaving Vance standing alone with the ghosts on the wall and the chilling realization that a legend was already walking among them, completely unseen. The morning of the exercise arrived, crisp and clear. The sky was a vast, unbroken bowl of blue. The entire company was assembled on the main parade ground, standing in rigid formation. An air of nervous energy, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, was palpable. Even the flag on the pole seemed to hang motionless, as if holding its breath. Corporal Thorne stood in the front rank, his uniform impeccable, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He scanned the edges of the formation, looking for the arrival of the heralded Pathfinder, ready to execute the sharpest salute of his career. At the front, facing the troops, stood the base commander, Colonel Jennings, a man whose stern demeanor rarely broke. Today, however, there was an unmistakable glimmer of reverence in his eyes. He stepped up to the podium, his microphone carrying his voice across the silent assembly. "Soldiers," he began, his tone formal and resonant. "For the next 5 days, you will be undertaking one of the most demanding training exercises this base has ever hosted. It has been designed to push you to your absolute limits, and you will not be undertaking it alone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We are privileged today to lead this exercise. We have a true American hero. It's an individual who has operated at the highest levels of special warfare, in environments so hostile, most of us can only imagine them in nightmares." A low murmur rippled through the soldiers. Thorne swelled with pride, as if the honor were somehow his own. The colonel continued, his voice laced with awe. "This soldier's record is a testament to courage, resilience, and a brand of quiet professionalism that is the hallmark of the truly elite. They have been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, among other commendations that remain classified. They asked for no ceremony, no special treatment. In fact, they have been among you for weeks, observing, evaluating, and preparing." The murmur grew louder. Soldiers glanced at each other, their eyes wide with speculation. Who could it be? The hardened, grizzled face in the crowd was secretly a living legend. Thorne's mind raced, replaying every interaction he'd had, hoping he hadn't made a fool of himself in front of this hidden giant. The colonel let the suspense build for one more beat, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before him. "It is my profound honor and my distinct privilege to turn this formation over to the specialists leading this training." He took a deep breath. Sergeant Eva Rostova, silence so absolute, so deafening, fell over the parade ground that it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Time itself seemed to freeze. Thorne's face, which had been a mask of eager anticipation, collapsed. The color drained from it, leaving a pale, sickly sheen of disbelief and dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He stared, his mouth slightly agape, as Sergeant Rostova detached herself from an unassuming position in the third rank and began to walk toward the podium. She moved with the same quiet purpose as always, her footsteps the only sound in the dead stillness. She wore the same simple fatigues, but now, under the harsh light of the truth, they seemed to transform, to become the raiment of a warrior. She reached the podium and stood beside the colonel. She didn't speak. She simply looked out at the formation, her gray eyes sweeping over the hundreds of stunned faces until they came to rest, with pinpoint accuracy, on Corporal Marcus Thorne. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into the collar of her uniform and pulled out her dog tags. They glinted in the morning sun as she held them up for all to see. The light caught the stamped metal. There was her name, Rostova E., and beneath it, the simple, devastating letters that changed everything. 75th RGR RGT, Task Force Omega. The colonel's voice boomed again. Filled with an ironclad respect, Sergeant Rostova served 3 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment. The person you have seen walking these grounds is not just a soldier. She is the Pathfinder. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than any physical weight. For Corporal Thorne, it was a blow that shattered his entire world. The arrogance that had been his armor, his identity, evaporated in an instant, leaving him exposed and raw with a shame so profound it was almost a physical sickness. Its carefully constructed reality, where strength was measured in decibels and worth was displayed on a sleeve, had been utterly demolished by 2 small, simple pieces of metal. He could feel the eyes of his friends on him, not with camaraderie, but with a new, horrified distance. They, too, were caught in the shock wave of the truth, their past snickers and whispered jokes now replaying in their minds as acts of pathetic, unforgivable ignorance. All eyes were on Eva, who stood at the podium, a figure of immense quiet, power. She let the silence stretch, allowing the full impact of the moment to land, to seep into the consciousness of every soldier standing before her. She wasn't gloating. Her expression was not one of triumph or "I told you so." It was the calm, steady face of a professional who had stated a fact and was now waiting for it to be processed. Then she looked directly at Thorne. Their eyes locked across the parade ground. For a heart-stopping second, Thorne remained frozen, a statue of pure humiliation. Then, something deep inside him, the core of his training, the very foundation of the uniform he wore, kicked in. His body moved before his mind could fully catch up. His hand snapped to his brow, his arm ramrod. Straight, his fingers perfectly aligned in the sharpest, most desperate salute he had ever given in his life. It was not a gesture of protocol. It was an act of supplication, an apology, a plea, and a profound admission of respect, all conveyed in one single perfect motion. Seeing their leader's capitulation, the other soldiers who had been part of his clique immediately followed suit. Their salutes were just as sharp, just as freighted with shame and a new, startling awe. It was a wave of silent apology rippling through the ranks. Eva held their gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of their gesture. Then, with a slow, crisp motion, she returned the salute. It was an act of grace, of closure. The war of disrespect was over. She tucked her tags back into her shirt, the soft clink of the metal the only sound. She stepped to the microphone. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, clear, and devoid of any malice. "Respect isn't about the insignia you can see," she said, her words carrying to the furthest rank. "It's about the soldier who earned them. It's about the uniform we all share. Nothing more, nothing less." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "Now, the real work begins. Let's get to it." The transformation was immediate and total. The training exercise that followed was the most grueling the base had ever seen, and Sergeant Rostova led from the front. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked NCO. She was the Pathfinder, and every word was scripture. Thorne, stripped of his arrogance, became her most diligent student. He was the first to volunteer for the hardest tasks, the one who listened with the most intense focus. He sought not to impress her, but to learn from her, to somehow atone for his blindness. The other soldiers followed his new example. The entire culture of the unit shifted, the superficial bravado replaced by a genuine, shared sense of purpose and a deep, abiding respect for the quiet woman who had shown them what true strength looked like. Master Sergeant Vance watched it, all from the periphery, a deep and lasting satisfaction settling in his chest. He had known there was more to her, but he could never have imagined the sheer scale of it. He saw Thorne helping another soldier with his pack, offering a word of encouragement, and he knew the lesson had been learned. The story of what happened on the parade ground became a quiet legend on the base, a cautionary tale whispered to new arrivals about the danger of judging a book by its cover. It was a story about how humility can be taught in the most dramatic fashion, and how respect once truly earned is a force more powerful than any weapon. The final image was of Eva, standing on a ridge overlooking the training area, the setting sun casting a golden glow around her. She was not a symbol of vengeance, but of vindication. She hadn't sought to punish her detractors. She had simply, by being herself, forced them to confront their own prejudices. She had earned her salute, not with anger, but with the undeniable weight of her own quiet, extraordinary truth.